Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back yet again to the Thousand Suns Breakdown, Part 4. This is a fat little bastard, isn't it? But hopefully we're getting closer to the end. So, the Thousand Suns, after having received their rather strict goddamn sentence, is sent back to Prospero. In fact, they are ordered back to Prospero, or at the very least, that is what Mahavastu Callimachus thinks. Personally, I'm not quite so sure. Considering Magnus's visions and wanting to interfere in Horus's fate, I'm wondering if he maybe didn't make up this as an excuse to return home, and begun researching how he could maybe save Horus from his rather unfortunate future. Speaking of Callimachus, it would appear that Magnus hasn't been using him as his personal scrivener bitch for a while, as he's actually started recovering a little bit. Additionally, a couple of his friends are starting to figure out how to decipher what he's been writing. Obviously, he's been writing in a language he doesn't understand because, well, Magnus is basically using him to record arcane secrets. Not really the kind of shit you want some random Rembrandts leafing through on a night off with a bottle of wine. I'm starting to suspect that Lemuel might be figuring out the meaning of the old saying curiosity killed the cat very soon, but we shall see, we shall see. Now, Prospero itself is a rather interesting place. It's nice and peaceful and wonderful, and apparently, regardless of the fact that you've never been to the city before, just walking its streets for a few hours is enough to make you intimately comfortable with walking them and being able to find your way all the time. I'm wondering if that really has something with the street layout or something else, mind you. And it is clearly a place where psychic potential is just running rampant with absolutely no regulations whatsoever. They describe a moment where the three Remembranters is sitting in a cafe, and before they can actually order anything, the waitress simply walks up with the stuff they want and hands it to them. Later, she comes with a bottle of wine, just when they wanted that as well. The waitress is a fucking psycho, who reads the minds of their guests. Now, I did say previously that I don't see the problem with the Librarius, a group of psychers trained by the Astartes to their rigorous standards. That is a weapon, a finely honed weapon. An entire population of randos all using psychic powers. Oh, that sounds like a ticking time bomb more so than a weapon. And speaking of psychic powers, the Thousand Suns had at the very least given pause to the idea of censure, and they had not continued the training of their new initiates, the Remembrancers, whilst they were en route back to Prospero. However, the moment they arrived on Prospero, any pretense of restraint was simply flung right out the fucking window, and everything went back to normal. In fact, they intensified their training. The Thousand Suns were quite blatantly ignoring the Emperor's decree to a frankly fucking ludicrous degree. Again, Magnus had the sheer brass balls to present selective truths to the Emperor to his fucking face, and he doesn't even pretend to follow his decree. Magnus is either really, really ballsy or really, really stupid. Granted, his plan here, and I say that with an ocean's worth of fucking salt, his plan is to stop Horus from defying the Emperor and falling to chaos by himself defying the Emperor and, well, eventually falling to chaos. That last part wasn't really in his plan, but it was the result. After returning back to Prospero, Magnus has his captains researching ways of projecting an astral body farther than anybody else had ever done. He didn't initially tell them why, but eventually he revealed his vision to them, the fact that Horus was about to turn traitor. They reacted with predictable shock and disbelief, but well, it was their Primarch telling them this, so they kinda had to believe it. The first reaction was, tell the Emperor, to which Magnus said, no, that'd be a silly idea. I can't really prove anything without telling the Emperor. Okay, so I immediately broke your hard fast rule of no psychic powers and used my psychic powers, but the bright side is Horus is a traitor and you can still stop him. Part of me thinks that the Emperor would probably have gone, okay, that was cuntish of you, but at least you warned me before doing anything more insane. We're gonna have words about this later, Magnus, but I'll go deal with Horus first. Maybe that's a bit too optimistic of me, but it seems like a more reasonable choice than the one Magnus actually landed on, which was, no, don't tell Dad, instead we're gonna fix this by using even more and more extreme psychic powers. Yes, sounds like having a cup of water when you're drowning, but hey, details. So, if telling the Emperor isn't part of the plan and using more sorcery is, what exactly is Magnus going to do? Well, apparently he had dug up an ancient Egyptian... Yes, an ancient Egyptian prophecy, I'm not fucking kidding you here, about Horus turning upon the Emperor. And since in his previous visions he had seen Horus falling, he figured that if only he could send his astral body to Horus, he could talk him out of it. The problem was that Horus was on the other side of the galaxy, which is why he had had his captains researching the projection of astral bodies to ridiculous lengths. And there was no guarantee that this ritual would actually work, but considering that Magnus didn't have a whole lot of options, other than telling Daddy, this was what he came up with. And just to add insult to injury, the ritual was fueled by life force. The life force of many, 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 many thralls. Oh me oh my. This is the problem once again with viewing the worlds in absolutes. If you only have extreme problems, you're only ever gonna have extreme solutions. But hey, as they always say, 2 wrongs always make a right, so best of luck with that, Magnus. Now, we move on once again to Ahriman. Ahriman is a fascinating figure, isn't he? So we get a couple of pieces of insight into his and the Thousand Sons' earliest days. Apparently, the name the Thousand Sons was created during the final days of Unity. There were 1,000 of them, and they were the sons of an ancient empire that had sworn fealty to the Emperor early on in his conquest, and had so been spared the attentions of his Thunder Warriors. Apparently, Ahriman and his brother Ortmund were sons of royalty. Explains his fascination with wine, I suppose. They were both gifted silver talismans by their mother, and asked to wear them, and so they did throughout their training. They knew that the superstition behind these things being protective talismans were nonsense, but it gave them a certain solace and connection to their previous life. Now, Ortmund, of course, died, or I feel like that's too mild a term, became a victim of the flesh change, which sucks quite royally for poor little Ahriman, and so now he carries his brother's talisman as well. Speaking of that, he also mentions that the Thousand Sons gene seed was created during a time of great turmoil in the warp. Coincidence? Unlikely. Oh, and by the way, he's telling all of this to Lemuel, a normal human, a remembrancer of all fucking people. Ahriman must have taken quite a shine to him. He even tells him about the flesh change. The Thousand Sons had been campaigning in the early years of the Great Crusade for 5 years until their powers began to manifest. They emerged naturally and smoothly at first, and the Thousand Sons rejoiced and used them with relish, thinking this was some hidden blessing ported upon them by the Emperor, because, well, what else were they supposed to think? But soon the flesh change began to take hold, and this is the interesting part. The first person to fall prey to it was possessed by a demon. It sounds to me like this wasn't a genetic defect or a problem with the gene seed at all. This was a literal demonic possession. Now, that isn't anywhere near enough evidence to state that the Thousand Sons gene seed was uncorrupted, at the very least at the early days. It might have been corrupted later, but it does sound a lot more like an actual psychic incident rather than a gene seed mishap. It is also revealed that the Legion itself didn't have the faintest fucking clue what was happening to it. They seem to have also have thought that it was a gene seed error. In fact, the people who were about to succumb to it as they became more and more able to see the sign, so to say, they began putting them in cryo-sleep and waiting for the day they could cure them. Despite the fact that the Thousand Sons could fire bolts of lightning from their assholes, they clearly didn't understand why or how yet. Then, of course, finally they found Magnus, and they were saved. Precisely 1,000 of them. And so they became the Thousand Sons once again. What a coincidence. I really like this part of the Thousand Sons lore. They keep tipping back and forth from being unsavable to being salvageable. My personal theory at the moment is the Thousand Sons were a highly psychically sensitive legion. However, if they had figured out how to control their powers and been taught how to control their psychic potential, they might have been able to survive and remain relatively untainted. However, the bargain that Magnus struck thinking he was saving them was probably the thing that finally made their corruption irrevertible. And interestingly enough then, him saving them was what in the end damned them. Obviously, this is speculation, so sprinkling in the salt and all that, but it would make a certain amount of sense. Now, let's get back to the whole ritual thing. Magnus was going to send his soul to try and save Horus. To do this, he had to do what was, you know that ritual he investigated and researched? It required 1,000 thralls, only 18 of which would survive. There's that number again. And it required Magnus to be stabbed through the chest with a special sacrificial blade. Yeah, this shit isn't sounding entirely above board, is it? Plus, for the 9 days that Magnus was gone, the streets of Tisca, the capital of Prospero, had some rather interesting, weather. It rained for absolute ages, and the rain apparently drove people crazy. They were cavorting naked in the streets and all kinds of insanity, and tens of thousands were infected with an extremely contagious form of lung disease, which spread rapidly, causing a mass panic and leaving thousands of citizens dead. Yeah, this shit is sounding less and less above board every moment that passes. And at the end of it all, it achieved diddly dick nothing. Or, well, actually, that's not true. It helped pushing Horus over the edge. Slow clap, Magnus. Good fucking job. But hey, on the bright side, his failure had now made him realize that it was time to run to Daddy and actually tell him about all of this shit. About 9 days too fucking late, but, well, details. However, first he needed more information. It had already been revealed to him, as we talked about in one of the previous books, that there were others that had already fallen, namely Erebus of the Word-Bearers. Thusly, more information was needed, but again, the Corvidae, with Ahriman at its head, really couldn't see much. They hadn't been able to see Dick for a very long time, so they had to resort to less ethical ways of divining the future. There was that one remembrancer who had the ability to see into the future, or, well, see into the future, the ability to be driven insane by glimpses into the future and having to furtively scroll them down on pieces of paper. She had been screwed over by the Sigeman, quite literally a little while ago, and the Thousand Sons had recently expended a considerable amount of effort in keeping her alive. Now, the Thousand Sons, with Ahriman at their head, burst into her hospital room, removing all of the psychic dampeners, keeping her sane, and burned her mind to cinders, including her physical body. Rather cold-hearted. Granted, Ahriman did feel bad, which, I mean, it counts for something, but Lemuel was none too fond of his somewhat blasé attitude to human life. And at the end of the day, it did nothing. Don't get me wrong, there was a lot of screaming involved, and there was definitely some peeking into the future, but she kept talking about wolves. Which, considering the betrayal of the Lunar Wolves, you can probably imagine, would be somewhat confusing. Nevertheless, any and all information at this point was very much so precious, and all of it was gathered together until Magnus could go and talk to Dad. What he chose to do next, though, is a bit of a confusing one. If this is right after Horus being turned, the warp should still be relatively calm, and yet, instead of sending a relatively simple astropathic communication, Magnus decided to go for another ritual. Now, of course, astro-telepathic communication is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. There's a great deal of interpretation required, and maybe the message of Horus turning traitor wouldn't get through properly because the guy receiving it would just be like, huh, I must have read that incorrectly, and just ignore it. That is certainly a possibility. Alternatively, the Thousand Sons could simply send a ship. Everything and anything really seems somewhat preferable to what Magnus actually ended up doing here, especially as it was going to be difficult enough to convince the Emperor that Horus had betrayed him in the first place, and trying to do so whilst shitting all over his edict. Well, that sounds like you're taking a bad situation and just making it worse. Nobody can ever say that Magnus didn't like a challenge. So what is this great and unholy ritual then? Is Magnus going to be projecting his body of light again by having himself stabbed in the chest? Or perhaps some new and interesting form of astro communication? Neither. He is going to be bargaining with the Chaos Gods to force his way into the Eldar Webway. At this point, I would prefer it if he sent word to the Emperor via fucking carrier pigeon, but hey, Magnus will do what Magnus will do. So, we do get again a couple of interesting little insights. Magnus had been scouring through the depths of the warp and had encountered what he at first thought was floating land masses in the warp, which is an interesting mental picture, but actually turned out to be vast sentient intelligences. These things are undoubtedly the Chaos Gods themselves. And Magnus had a vague understanding of this. He had previously told Ahriman that he had recently learned about chaos from his interactions with Horus trying to save him, and from Lorgar's little pet pupil, Erebus. However, Ahriman knew he was lying, which means that Magnus has had some conceptual understanding of the term chaos, but clearly he doesn't have anything even remotely close to the full picture, as he has bargained with these creatures before to save his sons, and is now thinking of bargaining with them again. Clearly, he has not put two and two together and come to the realization that these things are indeed the Chaos Gods. Hell, he even knows that they're called demons, but as always, Magnus thinks that Magnus knows best. And surely it's just some superstitious nonsense to call these things demons. Surely they are kind and benevolent creatures. Oh, yes indeed. Very, very benevolent. Ahriman, who I'm starting to think is the only good thing about the Thousand Sons, pleads with Magnus to please, Masha, please stop, no, Massa, no. But Magnus, of course, knows best. He also knew that trying this would be killing off the last of his remaining thralls, but, well, mere mortals. Magnus, I gotta say, he went from all being like, oh, I'm gonna help humanity out of the darkness to, what's another 900 thralls? Real goddamn quickly, didn't he? Unfortunately for Magnus, the Eldar had kind of realized that things might be trying to break into the Webway, and so had shielded it against just this kind of effort, and even Magnus could not break into it. Just as one of those benevolent beings of the warp rose up and gave Magnus just a little bit of help, tearing open a hole in the Webway to Terra. Magnus, of course, knew that there was a Webway on Terra because that was what the Emperor was playing with. Magnus tore a hole in that very Webway. Now, of course, we all know what the Webway is. It is essentially a tunnel. Magnus also had a basic understanding of what it was, a tunnel of sorts. What Magnus didn't realize is that if you make a hole in the tunnel, and the tunnel happens to be under the water, in this case the warp, then the water, or warp, is going to be flooding into the fucking tunnel. For being such a smarty pants, Magnus really is remarkably fucking dumb, isn't he? I mean, it's not like the Imperium is not aware of what happens when there's a rift in the Materium. Other legions have fought against this on multiple occasions. Surely Magnus must know that if you make a hole leading into the warp, bad shit is going to be flowing out, and yet, apparently not. Maybe he didn't think this through? I don't fucking know. I'm honestly struggling just a little bit to explain Magnus's actions here. Again, I can understand why he's hesitant to trust such an important message to astropathic communication. It is, after all, rather vague, but again, I'm not kidding when I say that fucking carrier pigeon would be a safer option. You have a better chance for some random-ass bird clad up in a half-ass spacesuit to flap its merry little bird-brained body all the way to Terra than you have of this working out for the better. And surprise, surprise, it didn't really work out. He came up against the wards the Emperor had put in place near the Webway for obvious reasons, and began trying to break through, but he did not have the strength, not even using the lives of his thralls and a considerable portion of armaments power to boot, until one of those kind, benevolent creatures of the warp came and offered him a helping hand. One he seemed to recognize, by the way. He doesn't outright state that this was the same one that he had had dealings with during the Thousand Suns crises with their little flesh change, but it is heavily hinted at. With the help of this benevolent creature, he breaches the Webway, burning out hundreds of wards beneath the Imperial Palace, destroying irreplaceable technology, and irreparably damaging the Golden Throne. Whoopsie. And as Magnus gets dragged back through the portal, and he doesn't resist because he is fully aware of just what a mess he's made, he sees armies of demons ready to rock and roll, as if this was all long since planned. You know that feeling you get when you were a child, when you wet the bed, and you don't really want to tell anybody about it? Well, this would be kinda like that, except you shat in the bed, covered the bed in shit, and then just to add insult to injury, wrote ha ha ha, you have to wash this now, in poop on the blanket. On the bright side, he did get to tell the Emperor that, oh, by the way, Daddy, I'm sorry for busting into your man cave here and destroying all of the things you've been spending literal centuries building, you know. I've literally wrecked the salvation of mankind here, but your favorite son is about to betray you. Just thought I'd let you know. Bye. At least for our sake, there's a nice little piece of fluff information in all of the doom and gloom. Apparently, the Golden Throne was not built by the Emperor. It was discovered, which is rather interesting. It also mentioned it was discovered beneath a desert, so it wasn't in the Himalayas already. Is this an Eldar artifact then? Eldar don't really strike me like the people who'd build a golden throne, but maybe. It is referred to as the key to the Webway, after all. It might just be that it is an artifact of the Old Ones, because I don't have the faintest clue what their preference in seating might be. Now, obviously, Big E had upgraded it and modified it rather extensively, and his plan, which he imparted to Magnus just as a final little fuck you, son, was of course that Magnus should sit upon that golden throne and utilize his massive psychic powers to open the portal at will and send the armies of humanity wherever they wanted to go. This, then, was the purpose for which Magnus had been created. He was supposed to be the gatekeeper, the, well, literal key to the future success of the Imperium. The fact that he was also the one to break the gate, well, poetic justice, I suppose. This is why you don't play with other people's toys, Big E. After returning to his physical form, Magnus was, unsurprisingly, rather bummed out about all of this. And so, when Magnus was at his absolute lowest ebb, a demon appeared in the form of his reflection, and did what demons like to do: rub lots and lots of salt in the wound while kicking a puppy. Speaking of being cruel and unusual, I think it's time for one of those commercial breaks again. Now then, this demon, he of course says that they never wanted to hurt Magnus, they only wanted to protect him. He was their first choice after all, but he'd grown too powerful and so they'd have to look elsewhere. Which is a blatant fucking lie. They'd been picking on Magnus from the get-go, and even Horus wasn't their first choice. Ah, demons, they do like their lies, don't they? A fact that evidently Magnus has yet to figure out. God damn it, Magnus, you are a slow learner, you know that, right? Anyways, this demon is probably Tzeentch, or at the very least one of his primary apparitions. It names itself Charonson, which is one obscure as fuck name. It's got its roots in our own mythology, 17th century, if I remember correctly. He's used in modern-day chaos magic. Yes, there are actually people alive today that believe that they can cast spells while standing in a circle. It actually happens. It's a strange thing, but they pray to demons, one of which is Charonson, the Lord of Dispersion. His number is 333 rather than 666. He is, in other words, a traditional, good old-fashioned devil. And an excellent choice for this story, honestly. Now, you see, Charonson, in one of his many interpretations, is supposed to be a final barrier before you reach true enlightenment, etc. He's there to break down your ego, something that Magnus has a bit too much of. And of course, his entire shtick is that he's going to use your ego to ruin your life. Sound familiar? Yeah. Poor Magnus. You managed to dig up an ancient Egyptian prophecy talking about the fall of Horus, but apparently the name Charonson, which the demon used in their first meeting, escaped him. For all his posturing, Magnus really is an idiot, isn't he? But at least he's a regretful idiot. You see, Magnus is a tragic hero, a real tragic hero. I hate what they're doing to him in modern 40k, just making him into an unrepentant villain again, because god damn it, that's just not Magnus. It really isn't. After screwing over the Emperor's plans, he was incredibly remorseful. He basically wanted to kill himself, but at the same time, he didn't want to just take his life. He didn't want to let his legion suffer for his mistake. He wanted them all to pay. He felt apathetic. He felt like everything he had done was wrong, which, well, again, should be fair, it was, but hey, details. And he just wanted it all wiped away, which is why, when Charonson shows him the fleet of space wolves rushing towards him on the Horus's orders, by the way, he simply just goes, fuck it, this is what I deserve. In fact, he goes so far as to kill some of his own legionaries who were going to raise the alarm so that the planet would be unaware and as undefended as possible. And to his credit, he does, at least partially, see through one of the demon's tricks. The demon shows him a vision of the Emperor in the future on the Golden Throne. This is the same trick they played on Horus, and on Conrad for that matter. I'm starting to think the Chaos Gods are a bit of a one-trick pony here, by the way. Oh well. And he tells them, of course, that this is Magnus. This was to be Magnus's future. Now, we can't be entirely sure that that isn't correct. We don't know how the Golden Throne is supposed to function. We know that while it's broken, it's not a comfortable seat, to put it very, very mildly, but who's to say that it would be any less horrible, even if it was fully functional? I wouldn't put it past Big E to, pretty up the truth a little bit, let's say. I do really love this part, though. Magnus's remorse when he realizes that basically everything he's built his life on is a lie and that he made it all happen. None of this was the demon's doing, as far as he's concerned. All of this started with his actions, his hubris, and he could have stopped this at any point if he had simply just taken a step back and went, wait a minute, maybe I should investigate a bit more closely. He is a tragic villain, a real tragic villain, as is Ahriman, which is again why I fucking hate how both of them are treated in modern 40k. It takes all of that subtlety, all of that tragedy, all of that remorse, and just poof, gone. Apparently now, Magnus has a hate boner for Guilliman and wishes to destroy Terra and the Emperor. Which, I'm really looking forward to how the hell they're going to twist that from this. That'll be interesting. I'm scared shitless that they're going to pull a, the mirror cracked on me here and give me some half-assed bullshit reason for why Magnus suddenly hates Big E, but to be fair, in quite a few books, Magnus is really hesitant. He wants to stay loyal, but he can't quite figure out how. He's in contact with Horus, but it's very clear that he's very, very hesitant to throw in his lot with the traitors. He also offers up his own soul and servitude in return for the demon sparing his legion, and oh god, wouldn't that be an amazing plotline? If Magnus had fallen, but Ahriman had not, oh, wouldn't that be so fucking cool? Ahriman would essentially be a secret loyalist trying to find some way to fight against Magnus. Oh, that would be interesting. I can't see it happening because, again, how they've been treating him in modern 40k, though one of the very few actually cool parts of the Gathering Storm does have him essentially throwing himself into a labyrinth with potentially no real chance of escape, purely because Ivrain resurrected some of his brothers, resurrected them from their rubric marine state, and threw them in there, that maze, which I really love, because that is supposed to be Ahriman. He is trying to resurrect his legion. He isn't evil. And there really is a limit to how many times I can state this, but I really do hate how the two of them have been treated in modern 40k. It's such a criminal misuse. Now, as for the invasion itself, Magnus did everything in his power to make it easy for the Space Wolves. He ordered the fleet, for example, to disperse, he ordered all of the monitoring stations to stand down, and again he issued absolutely no warning whatsoever to the Legion or its militia. The Space Wolves' original plan was to simply just bombard everything into dust, good old-fashioned exterminator style. Unfortunately for them, however, they do not have the correct clearance to actually deploy full-on Exterminators level weaponry. That is only the Emperor and Horus, and considering the fact that, as we will learn later, Horus was the one to give them their order to attack, he had clearly not given them the order for Exterminators because, well, obviously, he wanted the two legions to tear each other apart, and letting one simply blow up the planet, well, that wasn't going to achieve a whole lot of tearing, now was it? The Space Wolves did have a damn good go at it anyway, though, with a massive orbital bombardment, but the Kine Shield raised over the main city of Tisca proved to be completely and utterly impervious to the Space Wolves' guns, which is quite an achievement. That means that their power is on the same level as that of a Void Shield, a planetary scale Void Shield, which of course meant that the Space Wolves had to come down and dig them out, something the Space Wolves, to be honest, weren't that unhappy about to begin with. The Thousand Suns, of course, realized the danger rather quickly, considering, you know, the loud booming noises and shit, and they resisted with everything they had, using their psychic powers as well, of course, as their more traditional means of fighting. The only ones that showed any restraint were the Seventh. This is the training cadre of the Thousand Suns, a scout legion per se, except they weren't really scouts, they were full-on battle brothers, but they had not yet been initiated in the higher mysteries, and as such, their control over their powers was a bit, dodgy, shall we say. Which is why they, generally speaking, were not allowed to fight using them without a whole lot of direct supervision. However, as the battle continued, they also had to throw away their restraint, which was going to prove to be a very, very big mistake. At this point, the Thousand Sons had the invading loyalists, I suppose we should call them that, more or less at bay. They had them under control, at least to some extent, as much as you can ever have control over the Space Wolves. The Wolves themselves had launched themselves into the battle a bit too quickly as well. Their hatred of the Thousand Sons drove them on a little bit too fast, a little bit too carelessly, and the Thousand Sons punished them for it. The Space Wolves had also not been organized to actually fight a ground campaign against the Thousand Sons. They had with them several contingents of Custodes and Sisters of Silence, but not enough. If they were really planning to invade Tisca and Prospero, they would have brought a hell of a lot more. Again, this is due to the fact that they were sent there by the Emperor to capture Magnus, well, not even to capture. Basically, they were sent there for as a show of force to tell Magnus, okay, come home. The Emperor has some words for you, some rather harsh ones, but they were not there to attack them. That was Horus's achievement, as he had ordered them to actually attack. Now, you might be wondering why on God's good green earth the Emperor didn't send along an addendum saying, oh, by the way, Russ, so Magnus fucked off and destroyed everything, but he also told me that Horus had betrayed me, so, you know, just in case, if any orders come from that direction that directly contradict my own, maybe you shouldn't listen to those. That would have been smart. Then again, the Emperor had just had his most prized possession, his life work, his legacy destroyed in front of him, and he was busy fighting off an army of goddamn demons, so you can kind of excuse him if he maybe didn't think this one all the way through. Anyways, the Thousand Sons were doing a pretty good job, partially also due to the fact that the Paray and their massive titan, which they had placed outside of their temple as a trophy, well, they'd brought the thing back to life. They had exchanged a lot of its internal mechanism with psychically active crystals. These are the same ones they put in their battle robots. Essentially, they had filled the Titan with stuff that allowed the warp to leak directly into it. This, then, is in all due likelihood the very first Chaos Titan. And of course, again, the poor Space Wolves had not been informed that they'd be fighting a Titan, which, is a bit of a problematic oversight. Then again, you can't really blame them. As far as everybody knew, the thing was inert and destroyed, because, well, nobody tried to repair it, and it was most certainly wrecked when they brought it there. It was probably a rather large surprise to the Space Wolves when the damn thing started walking about, throwing fireballs everywhere. The two legions were quite equally matched. The Space Wolves' sheer ferocity, matched with their cold, detached tactical battlefield acumen, was well matched against the Thousand Sons' massively superior psychic powers, and in a straight-up fight, the Thousand Sons probably would have won outright, but with the Custodes and the Sisters of Battle in the mix, their task were made a great deal more difficult. What was going to finally tip the balance of the fight was the seventh of the Thousand Sons. They began using their powers freely, and since they could not control them as well as their more senior brethren, they fell prey to the flesh change. The interesting part about the flesh change is it has a sort of psychic bow wave effect. If one Thousand Son falls prey to it, everybody near him is also affected. It requires a very strong mind and a great deal of concentration to resist, and if you're currently being shot at by Space Wolves, you might not have the necessary spare time to really concentrate on not being turned into a chaos spawn. Though if you know what's good for you, you'll probably accept the bolt round as the lesser of two evils. We also finally get the proof that the tutelaries are not some nice, benevolent, innocent warp entity, as one of the captains of the Thousand Sons is possessed by his tutelary Utepa, and turns him into a demon host. He manages to retain just enough control over his own mind, partially due to the presence, amusingly enough, of the Silent Sisters. He only notices his own transformation when he sees his reflection. He will never know just how fucking lucky he was. Instead of being devoured by chaos and turned into a literal spawn, he only had his body turned into that of a monster. And realizing that simple fact, he simply stood there and let Constantine Valdor cut him down. Though just before he managed to utter one of the best lines in the book, Constantine Valdor is horrified and disgusted at this change that has corrupted one of his brothers. Seeing this kind of horror wreaked upon the Astartes' body scares the shit out of him. And so he simply screams at him, "You monster," before attacking him. And Phocis Dakar, having realized the reason why Magnus wouldn't fight, having realized everything that went wrong, just simply stands there and whispers, "I know." That is good. That is good writing right there. It takes the tragedy of the Thousand Sons and sums it up in basically 2 lines of text. All of the hubris, all of the hopelessness, all of the despair, everything. Really, genuinely good line. Especially considering what was going to happen next. The Thousand Sons had put far too much faith in their abilities, and now that they were pushed to the absolute breaking point, they were betrayed. One after another, their tutelaries turned on them and tried to grasp control away from their supposed masters. These attempts are described as being malicious and gleeful, long in the planning. These really were never the tutors, the tutelaries. They were simply just little demons who figured maybe, just maybe one day, I can play around with this guy's flesh. And particularly bad was, of course, again, the 7th. Now, the 7th was, of course, commanded by a veteran, and, ironically, he was the first one to fall. He had, how do I put it? He was literally turned into a gateway through which the warp could flow, but I suspect they attempted to open an actual portal through which the war predators could swarm and engage the Thousand Sons and Space Wolves. In all due likelihood, both of them, because, well, demons. However, something went wrong, and instead of opening up a rift, it created one hell of a boom that quite literally tore the heart out of the Thousand Sons line, killing God only knows how many hundreds, if not thousands of them. In a single instance, the heart was wrenched out of their formation. Add to this the constant degeneration of their forms into the flesh change, and a legion that moments ago had not only withstood the Space Wolves' charge, but were threatening to turn it, was suddenly and instantaneously shattered. Many of their captains succumbed to the change, and even their titan. It was a little bit too close to the giant boom, and so it too fell. With these events, the Thousand Sons' advantages disappeared one after another, and with the flesh change ravaging the Legion once again, they couldn't use their psychic powers safely either. This meant that now the Thousand Sons had to fight like regular Astartes, against a foe that outnumbered them rather considerably and had maintained their formation. Things were about to go from bad to a lot worse. Clearly, though, the Space Wolves were getting pushed pretty badly as well, since they saw fit to employ their Wolfen against them. Now, the Space Wolves don't like using the Wolfen openly because, well, obviously, the fact that they were willing to bring them out in front of the Sisters of Silence and the Custodes speaks a volume of just how badly they wanted to wipe out the Thousand Sons. And wiping them out, they were pretty damn close to. Only a few thousand sons survived at this point. Ahriman had a little reunion with Otha Virdmake, grabbing his spiritual essence, pulling it out of his body, showing him the truth of everything that had happened, including Horus' betrayal, and then throwing his screaming soul to a bunch of void predators. That's kinda cruel, Ahriman, but I kind of understand why. After this, the near destruction of his legion, Magnus finally could not stand by any longer and joined the fight. He gave Ahriman one last gift, the Book of Magnus, as well as the means of teleporting Magnus and the rest of his legion away from Prospero, whilst Magnus himself engaged in single combat with Russ, combat that Magnus eventually lost. But before he lost, he quote-unquote blessed Ahriman with a portion of his power, raising Ahriman's already rather considerable potential up to new heights, and then teleported him and the rest of the Thousand Sons onto the planet of sorcerers within the warp. How the fuck Magnus knew about this shit, I'm not even going to begin to speculate about. The rather sudden teleportation, including the fact that they were now in the middle of the goddamn warp, essentially, caused a few more of them to be exposed to the flesh change. A few more dozen had to be put down, and at the end of the day, 1,242 Thousand Sons remained. And as usual, nothing is ever a coincidence. The number 1,242 can, in certain contexts, that being biblical contexts, also mean a compact or pledge. In that specific context, of course, it is a compact/pledge between a god and its servant. Unsurprisingly, the Thousand Sons were a little bit depressed after all of this. Less than a tenth of their legion had survived. Magnus was dead, and they were stranded God only knows where. They didn't know, they had no way of knowing. Very little of any use had been brought with them. Some of the towers of Tisca had been brought along, but when they stared up into the sky, undoubtedly, they would have seen absolutely nothing of particular worth this close to the Eye of Terror. The constellations change just as often as the planets do. But finally, a massive obsidian tower tore its way out of the planet's core, and from its peak descended Magnus, except not quite. Magnus was indeed dead. Leman Russ had killed him. However, this was Magnus in a form of pure energy, of warp energy. Now, this is a little bit conspiratorial, because Magnus had always been an extraordinarily powerful psyker, and we don't really know what happens to these when they die. I mean, the Emperor is also basically dead, and yet he's still around. However, Magnus died. Back broken, head severed, crushed by God only knows how many thousand space wolves, who did God only knows what to his corpse. Ugh. You can bet your happy little ass it was not pleasant. I'd be very surprised if they didn't fucking atomize it, and yet here he is, claiming to simply be an incorporeal version of himself. And whilst again, that's not necessarily beyond the realms of possibilities, considering his actions thereafter, I'm tempted to suggest that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't Magnus that came back at all. Maybe, just maybe, there was a creature that had pretended to be Magnus not that long ago in a certain mirror on a certain planet. It certainly would explain some of Magnus's rather, drastic change, shall we say. But that is, of course, just a mere theory. Now, Ahriman is kinda pissed with Magnus, which is another interesting thing. Apparently this Magnus is having some real issues retaining the loyalty of his subjects. Huh, that's another potential hint. Some of the Thousand Sons embrace their new allegiance and their new forms, even accepting the flesh change as a blessing, a sign of favor. Ahriman was not of that opinion in the slightest. He wished to forge a massive spell that he called the Rubric, that would undo everything that had happened to his legion and prove to everyone that they had been right all along, and, more importantly, to prove that not only were they still loyal, they were the most loyal of sons. Now, of course, we know what happened with the rubric. We know that Magnus was manipulated, and now it's Ahriman's turn, which, again... So, Ahriman knows what happened to Magnus. Magnus told him. Hell, he even felt what had happened to Magnus. He knew why Magnus fell, his ego, and yet here Ahriman is, making the precise same mistake in the precise same way. Will they never learn? Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you very much for listening to 4 bloody episodes of this, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.